Hi, my name is Andrew Hollman. I'm the scientist with the Turfgrass Research Program at the University of Minnesota. The project that we're examining today is how to use glyphosate to control annual and perennial grassy weeds in fine fescue mixtures. The plot area that we're using here is a four-way mixture of hard, chewing, strong, and slender creeping red fescue. This was seeded in the fall of 2011 and is currently mowed at 1.75 inches. Now, in order to examine the different glyphosate rates, we looked at the label and figured out what the control rates were for some of the undesirable grasses that we would want to keep out of fine fescue, such as perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, creeping bentgrass, poa annua, and Kentucky bluegrass. Using those rates, and then also the rate that's listed to control fine fescue, we laid out the plot structure here so that we would cover all the rates in order to control all the species. When we look at the rate for Roundup, fine fescue is considerably higher of a control rate than it is for some of the other species that are listed. When we look at the plots here, we can see a treated control plot which is nice and green. We can then start at our lowest rate, which is 11 fluid ounces per acre, all the way up to the highest rate over here in the corner, which is 106 fluid ounces, which is the highest control rate labeled for fine fescue. When we look behind, we can see these different rates in the checkerboard effect that comes behind in the randomization for this trial and the 5 different replications that we have. So in each plot, we have 4-inch plugs placed of the species that we're looking to control. As we can see here in our 11-ounce rates, we have Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, poa annua, and creeping bentgrass. When looking at the plot, we can see that there is some slight damage to the fine fescue surrounding them, but this rate looks like it is very effective at controlling the poa annua and the creeping bentgrass. When looking at the other 3 species here, we can see that although they do have some visual damage on them, there's plenty of green leaf tissue and they should be recovering. Right now we're looking at these plots at 18 days after the spray application was made. The next stage of the research on looking at glyphosate tolerance on fine fescues is to make sure that the plots and these plugs of undesirable grasses are actually killed. So we'll keep evaluating to make sure that they're dead. To continue to look at the fine fescue to make sure it grows, and even though we may see some damage on here, to make sure it hasn't been completely killed. And then also we're going to repeat this trial in a fall timing to make sure that these results are consistent in the fall, so that we can take this onto the field and say whether it's in the summer or in the fall, you can apply these rates and they're going to be consistent for control and lack of damage on your fine fescues. So what we have before us here is a chewing fescue fairway, and there's been a lot of interest recently on using fine fescues for fairway golf courses in order to limit the amount of water, the amount of nutrients, and potentially the amount of pesticides that are used on them. Because when we're cutting at a lower height of cut, there are often some other undesirable grass species that could come into this fine fescue fairway here, we needed to look at what type of chemicals or chemistries we could have in order to control it. Now, the reason we chose glyphosate over some of the other selective chemistries of herbicides out there is that it's economical. Most people readily have access to it. It doesn't persist long in the soil or on the plant tissue. And it also can act as a growth regulator, limiting some of the other chemicals that people might be putting on their fairways in order to slow their growth or reduce mowing costs or other issues that sometimes golf courses are seen as having. So what we have here is fine fescue, chewing fescue specifically, at a fairway height of cut. And the 2 treatments that we have, the one on my right is the 11 fluid ounces of glyphosate per acre. And the one we have here on my left is the 22 fluid ounces per acre. Now, although we may see these dramatic differences in the amount of damage that we see, when we get close and look at the plot, what we're actually seeing here is that this damage is occurring to creeping bentgrass that had invaded this portion of the fairway. Although this one looks a little bit better, when we take a closer look, we can see that there's some damage, but it's creeping bentgrass that isn't fully killed. And when we look at the fescue in both of these plots, we see that they're relatively untouched by the treatments. So from the trials that we're looking at, we're going to further evaluate them to make sure that our undesirable grasses are controlled, that the fine fescues that we're looking at safely maintaining do regrow and recover from the damage that we see. With further testing in different seasons, and then also at this fairway height of cut, along with looking at other cultivars alone and different species alone, hopefully we can then recommend later on that these treatments can be used to control some of these undesirable grasses on fairways or higher heights of cut.